You were not created to govern your own life. You were trained to adapt to a script you never wrote, to accept limits you never chose, and to call destiny what is merely psychological programming. If Machiavelli were before you now, he would not speak of virtue or hope. He would speak of mastery. Because whoever does not master their own mind will always be governed by another, and every form of power begins precisely at that invisible point where illusion dissolves. From childhood, someone taught you to wait for permission to exist, to raise your hand, to ask for permission, to align your dreams with prefabricated structures. Making mistakes became shameful. Questioning became rebellion. Thinking differently became a risk. The system no longer needs executioners. It operates with bills, contracts, deadlines, and small rewards that keep the mind too occupied to realize it's trapped. Machiavelli observed princes, but he would perfectly understand this era, because the psychological mechanism is the same. Make a man believe he chose the cage, and he will defend it to the death. You wake up every day thinking you're choosing your life, but your choices have been slowly pushed upon you long before you realize you're choosing. Secure profession, predictable income, constant distractions, postponed dreams. All of this builds a specific type of human being: docile, tired, anxious, obedient, too busy to question and too exhausted to resist. Machiavelli would call this the supreme art of domination, controlling not bodies, but expectations. The world is not governed by written laws, but by unspoken impulses. Fear of rejection, hunger for validation, terror of exclusion, desperate desire for belonging. These forces shape markets, create leaders, destroy reputations, and manufacture invisible poverty. Money is not born from labor, it emerges from the precise manipulation of these forces. You can work your whole life and never touch the center of power, because power does not respect effort. It respects the strategic reading of the human mind. You were taught to trade time for security, but security is just a well-told narrative. Economies collapse, professions evaporate, currencies lose value while you sleep. Yet you call this stability. Machiavelli would never confuse adaptation with strength. For him, whoever depends on structures they don't control has already accepted their defeat with a smile. Observe how society reacts to those who deviate from the script. The ambitious are labeled arrogant. The strategic are called cold. The independent are seen as a threat. The system doesn't combat dissent with direct violence, it morally discredits it. It teaches you to reject those who dare to step outside the cage, so you don't have to admit that the door was always open. Dark psychology doesn't create monsters. It removes masks. It reveals that almost no one truly wants freedom, they only want the comfort of believing they are free. This contradiction sustains the machine. You are not poor because you lack intelligence. You are poor because you were taught to interpret the world through lenses that hide the real paths to power. You were never told about influence, perception, narrative, psychological leverage. You were never taught to use money as an instrument of domination, only as a reward for obedience. Because those who learn to control flows cease to be cogs, and cogs are necessary. Players are not. Machiavelli didn't believe in purity of intentions. He believed in an accurate reading of reality. And the reality is this: the world owes you nothing. It only responds to those who learn to press the right points. While you ask for opportunities, others create them. While you wait for recognition, others shape how they are perceived. While you fear making mistakes, others are already failing fast, accumulating experience, building an invisible advantage. Perhaps something is breaking inside you right now. An uncomfortable feeling that much of your life has been guided by maps that lead nowhere. This discomfort is not a crisis, it is sovereignty in gestation. Machiavelli would say that every ruler is born the moment he stops seeking approval. But make no mistake, awakening is not liberation, it's isolation. The mind that sees too much can no longer hide within comfortable lies. And it is precisely at this point that most return to collective slumber, convincing themselves that they never wanted to leave the cell. If you're still here, something in you refuses to be fully tamed. That's dangerous. Not for the world, but for the system that feeds on your predictability. From here on out, we will no longer talk about money as a number. We will talk about power as a psychological state. Because before you can dominate markets, you need to dominate the most contested territory of all, your own mind. And those who cannot withstand this internal war will never be prepared for the external one. You don't realize when it happens, but the moment you accept your own routine as inevitable is the exact instant Machiavelli would say you've handed over the keys to your life. It's not when you sign a contract, nor when you receive your first paycheck. It's when you stop being surprised by tiredness, when you normalize anxiety, when you start calling what has become your destiny a phase. Domestication doesn't come with a warning. It infiltrates like a habit you repeat until you can no longer imagine yourself outside of it. Think about your morning. The alarm clock rings before your body has even rested. You open your eyes and already feel the weight of the day. Coffee is quick. Your mind races to to-do lists, bills, unanswered messages. On your way to work, you see the same empty faces, each immersed in their own silence, all following the same flow as if it were natural. Machiavelli would see in this scene not an organized society, but an army marching without knowing who commands it. He knew that the most efficient power does not compel, it conditions. You arrive at your post, open screens, respond to requests, perform tasks you don't fully understand but need to accomplish. Maybe you're even good at what you do. Maybe you receive praise. But deep down, you feel that nothing you build truly belongs to you. At the end of the day, you take home a weariness that doesn't translate into achievement. And yet, you repeat the process the next day, convincing yourself that this is maturity, that this is responsibility, that this is being an adult. Machiavelli would call this the victory of structure over the individual. There's a cruel detail in this cycle. It disguises itself as virtue. You learn to feel pride in enduring more than you should, in accepting less than you deserve, in adapting to conditions that slowly consume your vitality. The system praises you for this. It says you are resilient, committed, reliable. But what it really values is your predictability. Because predictable people don't demand change, only minor adjustments. And then, every now and then, a spark appears. A video, a conversation, a book, a story about someone who went off script. You feel something strange, almost an envy that comes with hope. But soon the rational mind kicks in. It's not for me. I was less lucky. That's an exception. You extinguish the flame before it turns into a wildfire. Machiavelli would perfectly understand this mechanism. He knew that man prefers to preserve his internal narrative rather than face the discomfort of change. You also begin to notice the small betrayals you commit against yourself. The idea you never execute. The project you postpone. The skill you promise to learn next week, next month, next year. Everything is always later. The future becomes a repository of abandoned dreams. And meanwhile, the present is occupied by tasks that leave no trace, that accumulate no power, only keep the machine running. Perhaps you remember a colleague who left the company, decided to start their own business, began to appear less frequently, speak differently, walk with a different posture. At first, you rooted for them. Then, you started to find it strange. They no longer fit into conversations, lunches, or collective complaints. At some point, you may have thought they had distanced themselves, that they had changed, that they had become arrogant. Machiavelli would say that this is not a change of character, but a change of position on the board. Whoever leaves the cage begins to bother those who remain. There's a silent, almost imperceptible moment when you realize you could be building something of your own, but you don't know where to begin. Not because you're incapable, but because you've never been trained for it. You were trained to respond, not to create. To comply, not to architect. And this gap transforms into fear. Fear of making mistakes, of wasting time, of being judged. Fear of exposing yourself. Fear of discovering that perhaps you're not as good as you imagine. Machiavelli saw fear as the raw material of obedience. Not the fear of danger, but the fear of judgment. You look at those who seem to have won the game and imagine they had something you didn't. A connection, an inheritance, a magical opportunity. It's more comfortable to believe that than to accept that they simply started when you were still waiting to feel ready. They made mistakes in public. They were ridiculed. They lost money. They lost friends. And yet, they persevered. Not because they were stronger, but because they understood that the pain of trying is less than the pain of stagnation. Machiavelli wouldn't romanticize this trajectory. He wouldn't speak of passion, but of calculation. Of knowing when to advance and when to retreat. Of understanding that every movement outside the norm generates resistance. That every increase in power creates opposition. Therefore, he would teach us to observe before acting, to gauge forces, to test the ground. It's not about breaking with everything at once, but about ceasing to be invisible to oneself. Perhaps the unexpected turn of events won't come as a grand gesture, but as a different kind of weariness. One day you wake up and realize you're not just tired of work, but of the story you've been telling yourself about your own life. The narrative that things will eventually work themselves out begins to sound empty. You realize it's not a lack of opportunities that keeps you where you are, but how you see yourself within the game. And that's where Machiavelli's influence becomes almost palpable. He wouldn't ask you to abandon everything tomorrow. He would ask you to observe, to see the gears, the silent exchanges, the power games that happen in the corridors, on social media, in the negotiations you never realized you were making. Because the greatest defeat isn't losing money. It's going through life without understanding how the game is played. When you start to see things clearly, something changes. Small details take on a different weight. You realize who controls conversations, who sets the course, who always seems to be one step ahead. And, perhaps for the first time, you suspect that wealth has nothing to do with luck, but with a psychological understanding of the environment. This is the point where the viewer usually gets uneasy. Because understanding that you were inside a game without knowing the rules is deeply uncomfortable. And, at the same time, liberating. But liberation isn't easy. Comes with responsibility. From here on out, you can no longer pretend you didn't know. You begin to notice a disturbing pattern when you look back and revisit your own decisions. It wasn't just the big choices that brought you here, but hundreds of silent micro-returns, small concessions that seemed harmless at the time. One day you agreed to remain silent in a meeting, the next you let an opportunity pass for fear of making a mistake, then you started avoiding anything that required exposure. Without realizing it, you built an identity that doesn't represent you, but protects you from immediate discomfort. Machiavelli would see this as the formation of a submissive character, not due to a lack of ability, but due to excessive self-preservation. In everyday situations, this mechanism appears with cruel clarity. You have an idea, but you wait for someone to validate it. You sense that something is wrong, but you prefer not to confront it. You perceive power games around you, but you pretend not to see them so as not to compromise yourself. The mind quickly learns that neutrality is rewarded with momentary peace, even if that peace costs its own sovereignty. The curious thing is that no one forced you into the silence, you yourself constructed it as a way to survive. Perhaps the most unsettling point is realizing that, over time, you've come to defend this way of life. When someone questions the system, you respond with ready-made phrases, as if you were protecting something that benefits you, even if it doesn't. Machiavelli described this phenomenon as involuntary loyalty to the oppressor, when the individual begins to support the structure that limits them so as not to have to face their own inertia. Have you ever wondered at what point you started accepting less than you are capable of building? Have you ever wondered if your convictions are truly your own, or if they were merely inherited from an environment that never wanted to see you strong? There is also the theater of relationships, another territory where power subtly infiltrates. Think about how many times you've shaped what you say to avoid friction, how many times you've agreed simply to be accepted. This constant adjustment of personality creates a socially functional version of yourself, but each adjustment erases a trace of your true will. Machiavelli didn't believe in spontaneous harmony. He knew that all coexistence is a silent negotiation, where whoever gives in too much disappears. At work, in your family, in your circles of friends, you always observe the same dynamics. There are people who speak little, but when they do, they set the course of events. Others speak a lot, but never change anything. You may be in the second group, even without realizing it. Not because you lack intelligence, but because you have never been trained to maintain psychological presence. Maintaining presence is more than being visible, it's about being taken into account even before you open your mouth. Over time, this absence of presence transforms into a kind of comfortable invisibility. You don't bother anyone, you don't threaten, you don't provoke resistance. In exchange, you receive a safe place on the periphery of decision-making. And this exchange seems fair until the day you realize you're watching your own life as a spectator. How many times have you refrained from taking a stand in order to maintain peace? How many times have you confused acceptance with respect? How many times have you felt you could do more, but chose not to try? There is also a less discussed but central aspect to Machiavelli's vision. Self-control is not just about mastering emotions, it's about knowing when to show them. You might believe that always maintaining balance makes you stronger, but in practice, you may only be becoming inaccessible. People don't connect with the absence of signals, but with narratives. Those who never demonstrate tension, desire, or ambition are not seen as a threat or a leader. They are seen as background. This explains why so many talents remain invisible for years. They don't lack competence, they lack inner theater. They lack the understanding that the human mind responds to symbols, not resumes. You can be excellent, but if no one senses your intention, you dissolve into the crowd. Machiavelli would teach that perception precedes reality. First you are interpreted, only then are you evaluated. Perhaps the unexpected revelation is realizing that much of your frustration doesn't stem from the outside world, but from how you present yourself to it. You expect recognition for who you are, but rarely show who you are becoming. You want to be seen as someone of value, but communicate as if you're asking permission to exist. Have you ever noticed how people react differently when someone enters a room with quiet conviction? Have you noticed how their posture changes even before a word is spoken? The human mind works like a radar. It picks up intention before it picks up content. When you approach someone with a fear of bothering them, that vibe is perceived. When you approach with clarity of purpose, the space around you reorganizes itself. It's not magic, it's psychological reading. Machiavelli wouldn't talk about charisma, he would talk about internal coherence between what one desires and what one projects. However, this coherence doesn't come ready-made. It's built through friction with the world, in moments when you decide not to diminish yourself to fit in. This can happen in a simple conversation, in an everyday choice, in a refusal you never had the courage to express. Each micro-affirmation reconstructs your presence, as if you were reclaiming territory within yourself. What almost no one tells you is that this return to normalcy creates a sense of unease. People who always saw you as predictable start treating you differently. Some distance themselves, others test your limits, others try to pull you back to your old self. Machiavelli saw these movements as inevitable proof that something is changing. Are you prepared to lose the approval of those who only accept you when you're small? Are you prepared to endure discomfort without apologizing for existing? This is the point where the narrative becomes irreversible. Because after realizing that your invisibility was, in part, a learned choice, there's no going back to the previous state of ignorance. You begin to notice your own gestures, your pauses, your strategic or cowardly silences. And little by little, the mind ceases to be merely a place of reactions and becomes a space of decisions. From here on, the game is no longer just external. It happens inside you, every instant you choose between disappearing or asserting yourself. There's an almost imperceptible moment when you begin to realize that the game isn't just outside, but inside the small choices you make when no one is watching. It's when you understand that it's not a lack of talent that prevents most people from advancing, but an inability to sustain intention over time. Machiavelli would have been deeply interested in this modern phenomenon, people with more information than any previous generation, but with less ability to convert that information into real mastery over their own lives. Think of something curious that almost no one talks about. Recent studies show that the average sustained attention span of an adult connected to the internet has dropped to less than 9 seconds. Not because people have become dumber, but because they have learned to live fragmented lives. You switch tabs, check messages, interrupt thoughts, consume bits and pieces of everything, and don't build anything whole. Machiavelli would see this as a new type of psychological vulnerability. Those who cannot sustain focus cannot sustain power. There are accounts of entrepreneurs who went bankrupt not for lack of ideas, but for having too many. One of them recounted that, in 5 years, he started 12 different projects, all with potential, none of which he completed. Each new beginning was celebrated as reinvention, but in practice, it was merely an escape from the initial frustration that every project imposes. The mind prefers the enthusiasm of the start to the uncomfortable silence of execution. And this pattern, repeated by millions, builds a culture of eternal promises and non-existent results. Another unlikely fact: most people don't abandon their plans because they failed, but because they went too well at the beginning. When something starts to go right, external expectations, demands, and watchful eyes arise. And that's when many back down. The fear of sustaining growth is greater than the fear of never starting. Machiavelli would understand this as a panic of visibility. The moment you cease to be invisible is also the moment you begin to be judged. You might remember someone who suddenly disappeared from social media after starting to gain attention. It wasn't a lack of results, it was overexposure. Their minds weren't prepared to carry the symbolic weight of being seen. Because being seen isn't just about being praised, it's about being observed, interpreted, compared. And most people have never trained themselves to exist under that kind of pressure. There are also stories of people who became rich quickly and lost everything in a few years. The detail that rarely comes to light is that the collapse didn't come from the outside, but from within. They didn't change their identity as quickly as their bank account changed. They continued making decisions with a scarcity mindset, even when surrounded by abundance. They bought to prove something, not to build something. Machiavelli would have said that power that comes before psychological maturity turns into self-sabotage. And then the uncomfortable question arises: how many times have you felt you could take the next step, but froze just when things started to move? How many times have you preferred to return to familiar territory rather than deal with the weight of a new identity? The human mind is strangely loyal to old versions of itself, even when they no longer serve it. The digital world has brutally amplified this conflict. You can reach thousands of people with a single gesture, but you can also hide just as easily. The publish button and the delete button are an inch apart. This proximity creates a constant internal game between showing yourself and protecting yourself. Machiavelli would see this as a perfect arena for dark psychology. It has never been so easy to build a presence, and it has never been so easy to destroy it before it is even born. There are also the improbable events that no one expects. People who started a project out of mere curiosity and, months later, found themselves moving to a different city, changing their social circle, and even their identity. Not because they planned everything, but because they decided to continue when most would have given up. These cases don't go viral like magic formulas, but they are silent proof that persistence is not a moral trait, it's a trainable skill. You begin to realize that the true turning point isn't one big dramatic decision, but a series of invisible micro-acts. The time you chose to keep going even without applause. The day you didn't tell anyone what you were building. The week you worked on something that wasn't yet generating any return. Machiavelli would value these hidden phases more than any public celebration, because it is in them that the ability to act without immediate reward is forged. A curious phenomenon reported by organizational psychologists is that people who reach leadership positions often feel more lonely than when they were at lower levels. They begin to be treated with more formality, less spontaneity, and more hidden interest. This is not an accident, it is the direct consequence of altering their place in the symbolic hierarchy. And those who do not prepare for this loneliness often sabotage themselves just to regain a sense of belonging. Perhaps you recognize this movement in yourself. The impulse not to stand out too much so as not to lose connections. The desire to remain similar to others so as not to be accused of having changed. Machiavelli knew that collective loyalty is often a silent agreement to keep everyone in their place. Whoever breaks this informal pact pays an emotional price. But it is precisely at this price that the real difference arises. Not in figures, but in psychological autonomy. You begin to understand that growing up requires letting go of old versions of yourself and of others' expectations. That there is no upward mobility without social friction. That there is no inner strengthening without some kind of external disruption. And as you absorb all of this, something changes in the way you observe people. You begin to notice who sustains long processes and who lives only on beginnings. Who tolerates the tedium of construction and who feeds only on the brilliance of the idea. This reading doesn't make you cynical, it makes you lucid. And lucidity, as Machiavelli knew, is the raw material of any lasting form of power. From this point on, the narrative ceases to be about the world and becomes about the structure you are willing to create within yourself. Because if you can maintain focus, presence, and identity even when no one applauds, then you are no longer just participating in the game. You are beginning to redesign it. You reach a point where you can no longer pretend that nothing has changed. Something inside you starts operating on a different frequency. Conversations that once entertained you now sound empty. Routines that once seemed inevitable begin to seem like poor choices. And it is in this uncomfortable territory that Machiavelli becomes more present than ever, not as a historical figure, but as a lens through which you begin to interpret every gesture, every silence, every hidden game around you. You begin to see how small decisions shape invisible hierarchies. In a meeting, you notice who speaks little and yet sets the course. In a group of friends, you notice who never speaks up but always exerts influence. In the digital environment, you understand why some names are repeated, while others, perhaps more talented, remain in the shadows. It's not merit. It's a psychological reading of context. It's the ability to occupy space without asking permission. At some point, you test this new stance. Maybe you refuse something you would have accepted before. Maybe you express an opinion you would normally swallow. Maybe you start a project no one asked for. And the reaction comes faster than you expected. Some find it strange. Others question it. There are those who provoke you to see if you back down. Machiavelli would have foreseen this. Every change of position generates resistance because it disrupts the stability of others. It's not personal, it's structural. What surprises you is the mix of sensations. At the same time as you feel fear, you feel a rare kind of clarity. It's as if, for the first time, you are responding to something that comes from within, not just reacting to the environment. But this clarity comes at a cost. People who previously treated you lightly now measure their words. Some distance themselves without explanation. Others begin to observe you with uncomfortable interest. The social field around you is reorganized. There's a common scenario that illustrates this. You tell someone about a new idea and, instead of support, you receive irony. Do you really think that's going to work? The phrase isn't meant to help you, but to test your resolve. In the past, you might have laughed and changed the subject. Now, you hold their gaze and respond calmly. You don't need to convince them. You just need to stand firm. And this simple gesture changes the dynamic of the relationship. Machiavelli understood that power is first asserted at the micro level. Before dominating territories, you dominate interactions. Before leading people, you lead conversations. Before changing structures, you alter expectations. Every time you stand firm in an uncomfortable situation you would have previously avoided, you build a kind of silent authority that doesn't depend on position or applause. But there's a twist that almost no one anticipates. As you grow stronger, you also begin to attract problems that didn't exist before. People start asking for favors. Others try to get close out of self-interest. Some feel threatened and start creating small narratives against you. It's subtle, but constant. A snide comment here, an omission there. Machiavelli would warn that real growth never comes without antagonism. You then realize that it's not enough to move forward, you need to protect yourself. You start to be more selective about what you share, who you talk to, and the environments in which you expose yourself. Not out of paranoia, but out of lucidity. Because everything you build, however small, takes on symbolic value. And value attracts both allies and predators. There are nights when you wonder if it's worth it. It would be easier to go back to being invisible, to regain the tranquility of not being noticed, of not being expected, of not being observed. But something has changed definitively. The old comfort now feels like a betrayal against yourself. The mind can no longer fit into the old mold with the same naturalness. At this stage, you begin to act without announcing it. Instead of talking about plans, you execute them. Instead of seeking approval, you measure results. Small, silent victories begin to emerge. A contact that appears out of nowhere, an opportunity that arises because someone noticed something different about you. It's not luck. It's a consequence of psychological presence. And then comes the moment of greatest tension. Something you've built begins to show clear signs that it can truly grow. Perhaps it's a project, a new position, a network of contacts. And at the same time, you feel internal pressure not to go too far. Your mind tries to pull you back to the old version, the one that didn't bother you, the one that was content with little. This is the most difficult battle, because the enemy isn't outside. It's in the habit. Machiavelli would never romanticize this phase. He would say that the greatest risk is not losing, but giving up when the game starts to get serious. Because that's when most people sabotage themselves, not for lack of ability, but for fear of sustaining an identity greater than the one they've always had. If you cross this point, even with trembling, something solidifies. The feeling that you no longer depend so much on external validation. That you can endure silence, doubt, resistance. That you begin to move with an intentionality that didn't exist before. And it is precisely in this state that the end approaches. Not as closure, but as transition. Because now you are no longer just awakening. You are positioning yourself for something that changes how everything will be seen from now on. You've arrived here because something inside you no longer accepts living on autopilot. It wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. At some point in these words, you saw yourself reflected in them, as if someone were silently describing the movements that have always happened inside your mind, but that you've never been able to name. Machiavelli would understand this as the beginning of autonomy, the moment when a person ceases to be merely a character and begins, even timidly, to assume the role of author of their own trajectory. Throughout this journey, we haven't spoken of wealth as money, nor of power as imposition. We've spoken of a psychological understanding of the world, of presence, of focus, of identity, of breaking with invisible patterns. Now, all of this needs to move from the realm of understanding to the realm of practice, because understanding without action only deepens frustration. The first step isn't grand. It's intimate. It begins the moment you decide to stop hiding behind well-formulated excuses. Don't wait for a perfect day, for more time, for more security. Choose a skill that can generate real value for other people and start practicing it every day, even when no one is watching. It could be communication, writing, negotiation, content creation, process organization, sales, teaching. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that you start building something that exists outside of your head. Next, start changing how you position yourself in everyday life situations. In conversations, say what you think clearly. In decisions, take responsibility. In environments where you've always been just another face in the crowd, allow yourself to occupy space calmly. This isn't aggression, it's presence. It's the daily practice of not disappearing. At the same time, observe. Observe how people react when you show yourself to be more assertive. Observe who approaches, who moves away, who tries to pull you back to the old version. These signs are not obstacles, they are compasses. They show that you are deviating from the predictable path. And deviating from predictability is the essence of any real transformation. You will also need to learn how to protect what you begin to build. Not every idea needs to be shared. Not every victory needs to be announced. There are phases where silence is more strategic than exposure. Work behind the scenes. Let the results speak for themselves when they are ready. At some point, you will realize that you are no longer driven solely by hope, but by structure. That your days cease to be merely busy and become purposeful. That you don't react so much, but choose. That your mind doesn't wander so easily, because now there is a clear purpose underpinning your actions. This transformation doesn't happen all at once. It's made up of small, repeated decisions. Every time you don't run away from a difficult conversation. Every time you choose to continue when the enthusiasm fades. Every time you prefer to build something of your own instead of consuming distractions. Little by little, your identity stops being shaped by the environment and starts being built by you. And then you understand something that changes everything. It's not the world that needs to change for you to become stronger. It's you who needs to become more lucid to deal with the world as it is. Machiavelli didn't teach how to be loved. He taught how not to be dominated. And this teaching, when applied consciously, doesn't create tyrants. It creates individuals capable of sustaining their own sovereignty. Perhaps you still feel fear. That's natural. Fear doesn't disappear, it becomes a sign that you're moving toward what matters. Don't wait for confidence to act. Confidence is born after action, never before. Now, take a deep breath and choose one small action to put all of this into practice today. A conversation you've been avoiding, an idea you've been putting off, a step you always postpone. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real. If this video resonated with you, please like it now. If you'd like, comment on what impacted you the most, even anonymously. And subscribe to the channel to continue deepening this journey. Your transformation doesn't begin tomorrow. It begins right now.